To be, to become, to begin, where the river leans to the sea. To learn, to let go, to love. The world turns endless, turning me.
In today's conversation, we return to the central question of how to cultivate local neutral interdependence that effectively binds mechanisms of exploitation. And we begin by dissecting the design flaws of our current financialized system, specifically the individual accumulation of assets that drives status competition, and explore alternatives. And we acknowledge the inevitable risk of corruption, which Jim terms the blight, and discuss how radical, world-readable transparency serves as a necessary immune system for these collective structures. We then shift to the physical architecture of society, weighing the trade-offs between the efficiency of the division of labor and the fragility it creates. And finally, we tackle the thorny issues of governance and the life cycle of institutions. Jim argues for the principles of voice and exit, emphasizing that a free society must allow members to leave on fair terms. And we conclude with a radical thought experiment on the sunsetting of massive corporations. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
So last time we ended on a very interesting point, which was the question, how is it possible to create local mutual interdependence to bind mechanisms of exploitation and greed? And we said that's where we want to pick up again. And we could also try and fold one or two of the other topics that we had in lists into that. And I specifically see two that might be interesting to seed this conversation, which are governance and signaling.
Yeah, so those are all related, obviously, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah. Let's start with the. Let me recap what I remember. That we kind of stumbled into a conversation that we kind of went, interesting. Maybe we should intentionally cultivate interdependence, and that there is a tunable parameter of interdependence between people in a community, and it for any given community, and it probably varies by community and by culture. Eastern culture is going to be different than Western cultures. East Coast Americans would be different than West Coast Americans. Southerners are different than Northerners, which is what is the right amount of interdependence amongst people to a flourishing culture that doesn't degenerate into individual greed on one hand and doesn't become stultifying ineffective on the other. And like a lot of these things, there's a curve, and trying to find someplace good is probably important, but the search for someplace perfect is probably stupid, right? You're never going to find the exact optima, but get someplace fairly close, and be cognizant of the fact that this is a design parameter. And I have thought about it a little bit since we had that conversation. I even have an idea or two.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Let's dive in.
This actually ties into part of the long-running discussion I've been having with Megan in particular, but with other people about Game B topics, which is one of the serious design flaws of late-stage financialized Game A, in my opinion, is that investable assets are, in most cases, owned by an individual, and that puts people into competition with each other on who can build the biggest stack of chips, even if it's just for shit talking rights of who has the biggest stack of chips. You know, Jeff Bezos doesn't need another $1 billion to buy cheeseburgers, right? Jeff Bezos wants another $1 billion because he can say, nah, Elon, I got more money than you do. Nah. And there's an awful lot of that. And if it were not tied to big men, you know, the pervasive big man problem that Chris Boehm identified, I think we'd see a lot less psychopathic games being played. So what happens if essentially all investable assets are owned by membranes? And so let's start at the lower level, and we have approximately a Dunbar level group, 150, 300, 550, something in that range, community, and then we do as the early kibbutzniks did in the Israeli kibbutzes, and have what was called a shared purse economy, which is that everything we make and everything we spend comes out of a single bag of money. And if we invest smartly, the benefits go into the common purse. If we're spendthrifts and spend more than we make, then we all are equally poor, and causes us to think about the fact that we're not only nominally interdependent, but in this case, we are financially interdependent. And I do believe that single changing the nexus of investable assets from the individual to even just the first Dunbar group, the 150 group, would make a fantastic difference in how we think about everything. And of course, there's huge governance issues and potential problems and exploits and corruption that have to be dealt with. But I think by itself, that's actually a significant and relatively straightforward and historically demonstrated way to dial in a certain amount of interdependence. Now, this is also interesting about the dialing in. The Israeli kibbutzes in the 1920s all started 100% common purse, where all the money was pooled, and there was controversies about, for instance, whether inheritances should go into the common pool. And initially, the answer was yes, right? And then there was a big issue after World War II. The German government paid substantial reparations to the families of people killed in the Holocaust. And the question was, should those reparations go into the common purse in each kibbutz, or should they go to the family, to the lineage, to help the grandchildren go to college? And some kibbutzes went one way, and some kibbutzes went the other way. And so one could imagine the common purse being either fully absolute common purse, as the original kibbutzes were, or over time there could be agreements, or what we call accords, that say what goes into the common purse and what doesn't. And it might, so let's say, for instance, inheritances. Maybe the rule is 25% of the inheritances go to the individual, 75% goes to the common purse. But it doesn't really matter what the settings are, as long as you understand that there could be these settings. And so then you have the common purse. And then, of course, to your point, that puts a lot of load on governance. If I give up control of my own money, the great thing about my own stack of chips is I personally can decide, period. Nobody can second guess me. And so I have to trust the governance in a situation like that. And the governance better be well thought up. Let me introduce another concept, which I have come to believe is core to designing social operating systems. And I call it the blight. And the blight includes all forms of corruption, where people operate in bad faith, exploiting positions of authority to enrich themselves and to subvert the purpose of whatever their mission is. I mean, as we know, in many, what's holding sub-Saharan Africa back, I had this woman on my podcast, can't remember her name, brilliant woman who's from Senegal, I believe, and she has been leading a campaign against corruption and for introducing literally British common law and British business law to sub-Saharan Africa, which isn't perfect. No operating system is, but it's a hell of a lot better than the tradition of the reason you get. And a common purse Dunbar number community is going to have the risk of corruption. Oroville, which I think you're aware of, an experimental community, and I think you've been there in Asia, in India. Apparently, they have a quite severe corruption problem. That the people running the place have been stealing the natural resources, particularly the forest, and selling the money and selling the stuff off and putting it in their own pockets. And so every cooperative entity that cedes authority to people, because it's not practical to make every decision as a collective, introduces the risk of the blight. And the more, and this I think is very important, the more we trust that the blight is under control, the more we feel comfortable with group control of assets. If I'm in sub-Saharan Africa, no fucking way am I going to trust a culture like that to manage any significant amount of my assets. If I'm in Switzerland, I'm much more likely to believe that those people are culturally attuned to kind of a rigid sense of trust. You can trust a Swiss banker. You may not like a Swiss banker, but you can trust a Swiss banker. You can't trust anybody in sub-Saharan Africa, at least if they're in a quasi-official capacity, not to steal if they have an opportunity. And it also implies, when we're thinking about co-developing our persons and our institutions, to think carefully about our institutions with respect to their robustness against the blight. And it's always going to be a fight. The blight is not something you can kill. It's like cockroaches. You always have cockroaches. The question is, how do you reduce the number of cockroaches? And I believe, and other people I've been in conversation with also believe, that transparency is really important. For instance, imagine a Dunbar level community with a shared purse that has a bank account for buying stuff. Relatively simple rule is that the ledger for that bank account is world readable. Everybody can read it. Period. And the information in the bank account is relatively detailed. What was it? How much? Who did it go to? A memo, and who signed off on the transaction. And you could have relatively complicated rules on what you need to sign off. For instance, below $100, say person running the town sewer system can have full authority to write a check for $100 to pay somebody, but no $500 in any given week, for instance. And so it's Thomas, paid a laborer $100 today to help run the sewer plant, and as long as you didn't do it more than 5 times a week, that was within your authority. If you needed $5,000 to buy a new pump for the sewage system, then you'd need to be signed off by, let's say, somebody in the controller's office. And so it would show Thomas and the controller signed off on a pump, and the money went to Joe's pump service, right? So, and that's readable to everybody. I think that's absolutely critical, because the blight prospers in the dark.
So I get the stack that you're describing, and I'm going to use the example that you just gave about transparency in financial transactions as a way to walk more upstream and see if we can find built-in mechanisms out of which all of these things that you were describing actually emerge, rather than in putting them into governance and protocol, because those governance and protocols are always brittle, right? And so the example would be, or the walking upstream a little bit would be distributed ledger-based currencies. By definition, are world legible, right? You can see every single transaction. All you need to know is which addresses who. So in order to have, by design, at a systemic level, everything you just said about transparency, and that's it becomes a natural instinct to don't trust unknown addresses at all. There's no as soon as an unknown address pops up in transactions, you have to people will start questioning it because they don't trust it inside of a community. And the other picture I want to open, and then open it into an exploration of what could be mechanisms upstream to empower this kind of things you were describing as emergent properties, was what I mentioned last time when we spoke about what Tyson taught me about the interdependence in terms of actual physical elements of livelihood that everybody depends on, that where the interdependence stretches beyond the community, but also steps into the natural environment, the entire bioregion. And the bioregion becomes part of the web of interdependence, out of which the more healthy relationality emerges. What does that trigger for you?
Yeah, I think that's another adjustable knob. If we go back to Adam Smith, right, The Wealth of Nations, he gives the example of the pin factory, where he talks about an artisan who makes pins, little metal devices with a head on them. And you can either have one guy who smelts the iron, forms the iron, makes the wire, cuts the wire, sharpens the wire, welds the head on, and then he describes a division of labor where people with expertise do all these things. And he calculates that the pin factory will be 100 times as productive as the artisan making pins. Now there's a trade-off here. We also know, I think Marx, I'm not much of a Marxist, but Marx talked about the issue of alienation. The artisan making pins can have pride in his work because he did it all from beginning to end. If I'm the person sitting in the pin factory soldering the heads on pins all day, the feeling of personal satisfaction from my work may be less. But the pin factory actually is interesting because it's introducing interdependencies. You need the people who are doing all the different kinds of work to make those pins, and they have to figure out a way to work together. In the West, in late stage and even earlier stage Game A, it was the business, was the membrane that we use to coordinate our efforts to be able to take advantage of division of labor and other ways of being more efficacious in the world. And we could, we could think about that from a broader scale. For instance, as the our Aboriginal folks in Australia do, and and even in traditional, let's say, North American yeoman farming, different families specialized in different things. One of them had an orchard and grew lots of apples. Another one made wheat. Another one had a blacksmith shop and could make horseshoes. Another one was I happen to know some in rural areas, a person who was an expert in breaking horses, training horses. A person who's expert in training dogs for hunting. And so you have a community of people with an emergent set of skills of which you need you need them all. And actually references the complex science work. George Gummerman, who is an archaeologist, a field archaeologist, not a fancy computer guy. And he wrote some famous papers, I believe in the 80s, where one of the peoples he was studying, which was the Anasazi Native Americans, who built these interesting and in some cases very elaborate cities and villages that were perched on the edge of cliffs or in very remote places. And the question was always, why did the Anasazi die out? Because they did. They basically dispersed around, I think, 1300 BC. And his analysis was that to be an Anasazi civilization, you needed a certain number of skills. I think the number was like 100, something like that. And if you couldn't do all these things, you were not an Anasazi civilization. Then a period of severe drought came along for 150 years, and the carrying capacity of the land fell a lot. And instead of being able to handle villages of 150 over like 5 or 6 generations, the harsher ecosystem reduced the maximum carrying capacity that was within walking distance of any one village to 50 or less. And some of the necessary skills didn't survive that transition. And some of those skills turned out to be essential for gluing that civilization together. And it fell apart, and eventually the people just all left and went and did something else. They basically formed the Pueblo peoples, which was the next iteration of civilization, and it was quite different than the Anasazi people. And so in that case, it would suggest, again, the careful cultivation of the ensemble of skills necessary to operate some form of civilization, and being explicit about it may well be better than being implicit about it, because it is true. I mean, we think we're independent. I'm sitting in my house in American suburbia with my checking account, yada yada. I go to work, I get a paycheck, I make all the decisions. Well, the truth is, if the network stopped working, you'd starve to death in 2 weeks. There's a vast network of truckers and stores and warehouses and bankers and farmers and miners. It's an incredibly rich network that's provisioning us, but it's invisible. We abstracted it all down to financial transactions.
Exactly.
And further, we haven't thought through what is the nature of the network we want. For instance, all advanced economies have underinvested in the robustness of their electrical grid, as an example. If we were actually thoughtful about being provisioned even by our current network, we would be spending a lot more in making our electrical grid both robust and resilient. For instance, a solar flare of sufficient power, which occurred in the 1850s, called the Carrington event, which was so powerful that it caused telegraph lines to create fires and even killed a few telegraph operators. If we were to be of that size, it would very likely take down the grid worldwide in a way that might take months or years to bring back. Turns out, for a small amount of money on the scale of things, maybe $10 billion, North America or Europe, say, or China, so those are all sort of similar size units, could make their grids robust against a Carrington level flare, which astronomers estimate happens once every 500 years. So we're essentially rolling the dice each year, 0.2% that we don't have a Carrington event. If we do, we're hopelessly fucked. If we thought about our network of provisioning as this division of labor and a codependence, a mutual dependence, we might think a lot more carefully about the things that are choke points and that are indispensable for our continuing interaction with each other, and make the appropriate investments to make it robust and resilient. Or for the audience, robust means able to withstand a shock without significant damage. And you can do that, say, in the grid by shielding. And you can also do it by having certain breakers put in there. Resilience is the ability to recover. It turns out that the reason it's difficult for the grid to recover if it all goes down is that most of the biggest generators, like the big coal generators, natural gas generators, required electricity to start back up. And historically, there's been a certain number of diesel generators which do not require power to produce power, and the diesel generators can be used to reboot the other generators. But because oil has become expensive and natural gas is cheap, the ratios have fallen. We don't have enough diesel generators. Fortunately, the alternative energy sources like solar and wind do not require a jump start. I know solar does. I don't know about wind. But nobody has taken on systematically making sure that the grid is both robust with adequate shielding and resilient so it could start back up.
Helena.org is trying to, the Helena people are trying to sensitize the US at least towards that. Right? But I want to build on the division of labor and go deeper on that a little bit, because in a conversation I had with Forrest Landry, he estimated the number of necessary skills at around the same that you mentioned, about 100 or 200. And so you need a redundancy, to have sufficient redundancy, you need a population of about 1,000 people, right? 1,000 people is the level at which you can feel safe about continuing, even in the case of some disastrous event. Now, where the binding to the bioregion doesn't work anymore is when you have the said needle factory, because while you can bind all skills locally, you don't bind the material inputs locally. And that's the core difference to the ways of indigenous people or the farmers you mentioned. And so one interesting aspect, and you know that I am very interested in that, is localizing the material pathways, because not only can that then in an emergent way provide this localized binding, because it's just much more convenient and cheaper to source everything you need on a material level locally, but it also makes you at the same time more independent from actors elsewhere, right? You're not dependent on globalized supply chains and all of that, but you can grow your material inputs locally. What do you say to that? So how do you think about that as a pathway, and similar pathways that help us really be localized?
Yeah, I think that there's a tension, which is all the things you said are true, that it is beneficial in many ways to source things locally or relatively locally.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, the yeoman farmer communities might have been spread out over 30 kilometers, something like that. So they weren't necessarily co-located, but they were within a couple of days wagon ride to meet once every 2 weeks at a market town and trade with each other. So you have to tune what is the right level of locality, and it also depends on the item. For instance, even forager peoples in North America. I imagine the same was true in Australia. I don't know, but North America, even very early days, there was pretty widespread trade in certain kinds of rocks, in particular obsidian, which is a form of volcanic glass, and is probably the best material for making Stone Age arrow heads. It's light and it's very, very sharp. And the network of obsidian is very rare. And there's only a few places where obsidian occurs naturally in any given bioregion or georegion. And the trade in way farther than any one group of forager people would ever move, but it went from one to the other to the other to the other. So where the obsidian outcroppings were, the local people that controlled that asset traded it to their neighbors, who traded it to their neighbors, who traded it to their neighbors. And the next thing you know, obsidian from New Mexico was in Virginia, even though nobody ever traveled more than 30 kilometers probably. Mm-hmm. And so we have to think about the material. If we want to, if we to the degree you're using iron, well, there is iron most places. The deposits of rich iron are way better than trying to make things out of really weak iron. So there's a pragmatic thinking about how local it really makes sense to be. I use the example fairly often. We're talking about membranes, Dunbar level, proto-B type membranes. It's gonna be a long time before we make our own computer chips, right? And so we have to, sort of build into our thinking how we deal with that fact that it's just not very sensible for us to invest $15 billion in building our own state-of-the-art computer chip factory. And so we just should just assume that we're going to be trading with other people, some of them very far away, and some of the people we probably don't like, to get our computer chips. Now, of course, on the flip side of that, one could have an ethos towards localization. We might decide, well, let's minimize our dependence on computer chips. Let us build a society that, yes, we want computer chips for some things, but do we really need computer chips in our washing machines? Probably not. We got along for a long time without them. Do we need computer chips in our cars? We don't. You know, I used to wrench on cars a lot when I was a teenager. I could take the engine out of a car and put a new one in back in 1965. Can't do that today. All these fancy computer chips and all that sort of stuff. Maybe we just make a decision that in our region, we're going to have as much of our machinery as possible be non-digital, as an example. No, by the way, you get a free lunch in that it's much more robust against a solar flare or a nuclear explosion. And so you pick up some free robustness and resilience if you make the principled decision to minimize your exposure to the digital, just as an example. But you probably don't go to 100%. You still would like to have access to the internet for various things. And so maybe you say, maybe we need 100 microprocessors in our community. If you're living a, middle class, upper middle class American life, I bet you have 100 microprocessors just doing your own work today, and most of them you don't even know about. And before long, it'll be 1,000. Nasty little secret. How did Hewlett Packard fuck us all over so we can't use third-party ink cartridges anymore? They put a microprocessor in their cartridges. And that's why I keep my old laser printers. I mean, goddamn, if I buy a new one, because I want to be able to use third-party chips. So there may be some, disciplines, digital hygiene around keeping the number of chips in our lives low, and that gives us many different wins, including improving the ability to make things and work on things. Pre-chips in a computer, a village of 50 people could very easily have someone that could work on tractors and cars. Today, you need a vast supply chain of instruments and all kinds of crazy ass shit to even fix a tractor, which is mind-boggling.
Mm-hmm. We rooted the conversation last week in the 10,000 year horizon, right? And then started asking questions about what is infrastructure that is required towards this. And this is how we landed in this conversation.
Yes.
And I think it's also related because the 10,000 year horizon says we need to be or we want to be galactic or intergalactic even, right? Which could be yet another angle into looking into localized independence, but also interdependence. Because if you're the first colony on Mars, you don't want to travel around the entire planet all the time to get a few of the rare earths that you couldn't bring with you, right? So you need to have much more innovation in the way we do things, and have alternative material pathways to building machinery like the ones we're using right now to have a conversation. And at the same time, in order to get there, I would argue, and I think you invoked the Stuart Kaufman idea of the adjacent possible, right? To really effectively tap into adjacent possible, we also need to tap into the scaling laws that Jeff West and crew found, right? And so far, the best solution to that problem that humanity has found is to clump people together in physical space. So we won't be able to clump people in physical space for several reasons, either for ecological pressures on this planet or for resource pressures on other planets. So we need to have the innovation and intellectual density of a city, but across time and space. So what comes to mind when I open the space in that direction?
Yeah, the person who's done the best job of synthesizing this is Jordan Hall in his concept of the civium, and he specifically uses the work of Geoffrey West and Louis Betancourt, who took the scaling laws, and he's the one that found all these interesting things about cities. You know, that cities basically become 15% more effective at creating new ideas, you know, moving into the adjacent possible more rapidly. It turns out they also walk 15% faster. Every time you double the populations, you go from 1 million to 2 million, you'll have, you know, 2.3 times as many patents, not just 2, right? But the bad also scales at the same exponent. So you'll have 2.3 times the crime, 2.3 times the mental illness, 2.3 times the pollution, 2.3 times even the disease. Interesting, because if what's making innovation happen faster, which is the mixing of people is also spreading diseases and is a evolutionary petri dish for discovering more virulent forms of disease, right? COVID would not have spread or gotten through so many evolutionary paths if we lived in a civilization of 150 people. Just wouldn't have had the petri dish to evolve so fast, as an example. And so I would, you know, look to the Jordan Hall idea of the civium as a pretty well thought out possible path to the future. And he explicitly says we still want to do big things. You know, the example I give is the long baseline gravitational astronomy. It's a weird example, but it's one that took 30 years of people all over the world working together to be able to use gravity waves to explore the universe. And it works amazingly, right? And you needed thousands of people working together. Though it's an interesting example because not too many of them were all in one place. They were scattered across the in the global south as well as in the global north. And, you know, sort of using that as an aspiration of maybe all of our big things can be addressed that way. And at a minimum, we should have a preference towards those big things which can be addressed that way. And so I think that's, you know, I think that's a systematic way to think about directionally on how we should like our civilization to evolve towards smaller groups, but groups that are interconnected in a way aspects of cities can occur without accumulating the negative exponentials.
So this requires careful scaling up of governance across all scales and levels, right? And what would you say are some of the absolutely non-negotiable principles of governance in a multiplanetary setup, or towards a multiplanetary setup?
Yeah, this is a really tough question. I have to admit, nobody has solved it.
Of course not. But
we're thinking towards what might be important elements in such a system. And the other thing, of course, to keep in mind is I certainly hope nobody thinks they've solved it for forever, right? This is the utopian fallacy, right? The dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Sorry, or, you know, the Volk über alles, right? No, these are all bad governing principles, as it turned out. And you need to be able to abandon and or modify. And this is a key point. I'm actually writing an essay on this soon. Viscosity is a hugely important design parameter in your governance system. Viscosity meaning how quickly can things change. You know, in the U.S. Governing system, there's much viscosity built in. You have to pass both houses of Congress, signed by the president, to change the Constitution. It's much more onerous. You got to get 3/4 of the states to agree. To pass a bill, even you have to get past the filibuster, which is a supermajority requirement in the Senate. All those are viscosity settings. And I will say they were set in 1787 by some very brilliant but very parochial people living in the United States. And they're almost certainly far from optimal. And in fact, many of our issues in our politics, I believe, is that our viscosity settings are incorrect. And not only are viscosity settings incorrect today, but we have no meta mechanism to adjust the viscosity settings, or at least ones that are accessible. In theory, in the United States government process, you can always amend the Constitution with one single exception, which cannot be amended. But it's very onerous, and that viscosity setting is set very high. So constitutional amendments have only happened like 27 times in the whole history of the United States, and many of them were technical fixes. Actually, substantive ones, maybe 15 at the most. And that's probably too low. And so thinking about both the current, a current and the meta viscosity rules, I think is essential for thinking about and growing, organically gardening your governance system. The other principles, but a lot of principles that come to mind, but two that I have come to really think are deep. I stole from a guy named Max Borders. I don't know where he got them from. He calls it voice and exit. And this is addresses two very interesting issues. One, Forrest Landry actually makes a pretty good argument that traditional majoritarian voting is not a really great way to make decisions, because you end up with the minority hating the majority, or at least potentially, what Gregory Bateson called sigmogenesis, that once you put on team labels, psychologists have found this in lab experiments, you take a bunch of students, give them green armbands or red armbands, within a week, they're persecuting each other because of green armbands versus red armbands. And majoritarian voting does that. There's a tendency towards that. And of course, many countries have different architectures. The German has the very interesting dual method of electing representatives, one from a locality, but the other from a party list on a nationwide basis or a statewide basis. And that's one setting. US has all local districts. Israel has all party list, which they produce very different systems. Israel has like 25 parties in a tiny little country.
More. It's crazy.
More even. And US has 2, and Germany has 4 or 5, right? Yeah. So those institutional settings on how you make decisions and how you elect representatives have real implications. And so I think Max wisely stepped back a bit and said, what is something more general than, say, majoritarian democracy or all these various different settings for institutional structures, and said voice. Every system must have a voice for everybody. So everybody has a role of some sort in the decision-making apparatus. And I would hope there'd be a lot of innovation in how the voice is implemented. But the fundamental principle is, and this is part of the Enlightenment, before the Enlightenment, we had 10,000 years of rule by violent big men, kings and warlords and knights and all this sort of stuff. In the UK, at least, and you can call that where it took off from. 1688, the Glorious Revolution was established that the king is to the parliament, period. And the parliament is elected by some subset of the people, initially an oligarchic subset, but over time that increased until eventually by the early 20th century, all UK citizens, at least men initially, and then women, could vote. And so the concept of voice evolved, but the concept of voice was made, rock solid in that glorious revolution of 1688. The other one, exit, is quite interesting and ties back to our discussion about collective asset management. So let's think of our community that has a common purse. Everything we've made, with possibly some exceptions, but maybe not, has gone into the purse. All the expenditures have come out of the purse. Capital assets have been built, housing has been built, the local swimming pool has been built, 10 businesses have been started, etc. Now suppose I decide I don't like the direction that this community is going in. A charismatic sociopath has become a cult leader. I think it's very important, and Max highlights this, to have the ability to exit on fair terms. One of the pure signs that Marxist-Leninism was a horrible, evil system was they refused to let people leave. I mean, I would say at the 100% level of certainty, any community of any scale that tries to make it impossible to leave is fundamentally corrupt and should be overthrown right now. It's just absolutely fundamental that if you have to be able to vote with your feet and leave. But the more subtle piece is, it's also, I believe, important that you be able to leave on fair terms. So if you've been a participant in this shared purse community, and we fortunately have the financial technology to track this, you should have some carried interest in the entity, in the same way if you are an investor in a limited partnership. You get, in fact, in the United States at least, you get a statement each year from the entity saying, what is your current carried interest? Did it go up? Did it go down last year? And here's how it was calculated. And there's typically governance rules that says if you want to leave the limited partnership, this is how you get paid out your carried interest. And it's generally not on the spot, because it could, destroy the liquidity of the entity. It's often over 5 years or in 5 years. But this is something that we all knew about when we entered the limited partnership, what the exit rules were. And so I would suggest that if one was building a common purse community, one should pay particular attention to the exit rules. And do we feel that should our need to exit occur, be relatively fairly dealt with in getting what we had, some part at least of what we had put into the community back out should we leave. And so at the highest level, I think voice and exit are principles that we should always be thinking about. And then voice leads to considering many different ways of making decisions, and exit basically talks about what happens if it's not working for us anymore. And of course, the threat of exit is an interesting feedback loop on any entity. Think of a mutual fund, which is kind of a simple-minded kind of limited partnership. If people in the mutual fund start cashing in their mutual fund shares, that sends the signal to the people running the mutual fund that they're not doing a good job, and they better start doing a better job unless they want all their money to walk out the door. So I think of exit as a very important feedback loop to a membrane, so that it can read when people leave. That's a sign. Now, of course, some cases I'm glad that asshole left, but okay, that's fine. But somebody who's a valuable member of the community leaves, and they go, whoa, should provide an opportunity for introspection on what were we doing wrong that it didn't work for Jim anymore, and he decided to leave.
Do you think it might be helpful to create a generalized concept out of this, where everything, every rule, every entity, every asset, every product, everything should have, just as it has a birth, which is the voice in a sense, it should have a death, which is the exit, or so examples would be what the Consilience Project decided to do, to have an intentional death date. Same goes for our friends at AIM and Imagination. but I was also very surprised, not so much in hindsight, but back then, about I don't know, 10 years ago or something, I had the chance to ask Elon some things. And so one of the things I asked him was about governance principles for Mars. And without even thinking immediately, he said sunsetting of law is an important design principle. So could we generalize this and say whatever is being created also needs to have a plan of how it is returned to nothing?
I think that's a good idea in principle. On the other hand, because we can't foresee the future, we need to be able to dynamically tune that. And we see this in DAOs sometimes in the crypto world, which is, okay, this thing is going to distribute in 10 years, but by this mechanism, a supermajority vote by the token holders, we can defer it 1 year at a time, as an example, where you have default death date, but you have the ability to defer it, but you make it, or you could even make it increasingly difficult that 55% can defer it for 1 year, 60% for 2 years. But so these are all kind of like viscosity. How fast, how much can you change things? I also would love, if I were rewriting the American Constitution, I would put in the, when you pass a law, you have to be explicit about its sunset period. And the default for a majoritarian law would be 5 years. If you could get a 60% vote in both houses for your bill, maybe you could go to 10 years. If you get a 70% vote, maybe the initial sunset would be 20 years. But they'd all have sunsets, and the difficulty of reaching the consensus would provide the length of maximum life you could build into the law, let's say, or the new agency. I do believe that, especially in politics, zombie entities and zombie laws are a real problem, and that things should be rethunk periodically. And if they're not rethunk, they should die. And our entrepreneurial space is actually pretty good about this. And let me compare the entrepreneurial space with the corporate space.
Okay.
My career was about 50-50 between the two, actually. So I've got perspective on both of these. In the corporate space, often projects just go on forever, long after they make any sense, because the people on the team have friends, and the bosses don't want to make a hard decision and terminate it. And and Group A negotiates with Group B to get support, and together we'll lobby the bosses. And I would say corporate America is way full of zombie efforts. Venture capital, entrepreneurial finance, much less so. You have a gate. The gate is the next round of financing, right? And let's say your initial funding is typically good for maybe a year. At the end of that year, the people that are providing your funding, or alternative people to provide you funding, look at it and say, all right, you guys took $1 million. This is what you did. Have you significantly increased the value of that enterprise above the $1 million that you got? Or have you found some things that make it believable to put more money in it? And if you don't, nobody puts more money in it, and it disperses. The people go on their way and mix and match in other projects. Now, we tried to build that in somewhat artificially in corporate land by putting, we call it gates on new efforts, and we define when the gates would be. And if you did not pass the gate, the entity dissolved, the internal entity. And so I think that principle is a very sound one. And what the details are in any given setting, I have no idea. But putting mandatory death, if not X, is absolutely essential. And in time Y is probably very useful.
Especially because that startup that has to survive the market will potentially turn into a corporate at one point. But we've had some of these, and then the rules change, and there's no protocol for this thing to ever die.
Exactly. And smart design. I mean, what the fuck? Why should Facebook be gobbling up the world, right? Maybe it was a good idea at the beginning. I don't know, but it's certainly not a good idea now. Or Google, or any of these giant voracious monoliths who have their own inertia to just gobble the world. If we had said Google will die in 10 years, the world would be way better off, right? The assets would have been, keep in mind, it doesn't mean that Google search goes away. And it just means the assets would be sold off to somebody else who would recombine them in different ways and with different cultures and different intent. Though maybe we can jump to this. The intent question is a huge one. If we think about the adjacent possible, I recently wrote an essay on Substack about the adjacent possible, which, if I do say so myself, was pretty good and pretty clear. We mean that the world is in a given state at any given point in time, right? All the things that we're doing or could do. And then next to that are the set of things we could do. And I gave the example in the paper, by 1983, it was possible for Steve Jobs to, with a team of people, design the Mac. And they made a whole bunch of decisions, recombining technologies that already existed, and then a few little pieces like the Windows operating system, which they stole the idea from Xerox. They wrote it themselves. And they combined all these pieces into a new adjacent possible, which was a certain kind of computer with ease of use, intuition, non-nerd tech leanings. And it went into the world and was relatively successful. One of the decisions they could have made, and one could even imagine Steve Jobs doing this, is to choose a non-standard keyboard. The keyboard that we use in the West, we call the QWERTY keyboard, because the first letters, let me pull this cable away, on the first line of letters are QWERTY. So people call it the QWERTY keyboard. It's been proven that is not an optimal keyboard, that it was designed due to the limitations of typewriters. It's very weird, the story. Look it up online, the story of the QWERTY keyboard. There are several other designs for keyboards that are technically superior for ease of learning and speed of typing. But Steve Jobs wisely did not choose to Mac with a non-standard keyboard. And why is that? Because in our economy, the economic aspects of how our world unfolds, the adjacent possible, there are a bunch of pruning rules about what is essentially allowed to survive in the adjacent possible. And one of those is, will people adopt it? And a non-QWERTY keyboard, even though Steve Jobs might have said, wouldn't it be cool to have a different kind of keyboard that's proven better? People would have said, fuck that. I don't want to learn a new keyboard. Hell with that. I'm not going to buy a Mac. It would have been a substantial barrier to innovation, even though the world might have been better eventually if that had happened. The pruning rules, the way our world works, it was not going to happen. And he smartly didn't do it. But the other pruning rule is substantially more questionable. And that is it profitable? Will it produce a money on money return? And so we take our case of Google being broken up because it had reached its kill-by date, and you sold the search engine business, let's say, to some private equity people. They would still be completely driven by, how do I make Google more profitable, not how do I make search a better asset for humanity. And so Harold Morowitz, who was actually my first mentor in complexity science, brilliant guy, wrote a book called The Emergence of Everything, where he talks about 28, I think it is, stages of emergence. I think we talked about this last time, from the Big Bang to spirituality. And each of those generates pruning rules, which are what's the probability space of things happening from that emergence? Where we are in late stage game A is that money on money return is the overwhelming pruning rule. And so those things which are both profitable and at least people with money think are very likely, that could be adopted, got it backwards, could be adopted and will be profitable, or at least we think will be profitable, are what is called into being by our financialized world of innovation. Let me give you an example, a current pet peeve of mine. If you watch sports on TV, which I don't do a lot, but I did watch the World Series a bit. I watch the occasional football game. The broadcasts of these things are unbelievably dominated by sports betting apps. And sports betting apps have been recently called into the world because they were doable. And for some reason, they hook a certain part of the mammalian brain, particularly on young men, and particularly on young men who are drinking a lot of beer at the time. And if you tune them psychologically correctly, they're. And so we now have an utter proliferation of these things that, just as you would have expected, they get more and more expert at draining your wallet. The current state of play in the United States, don't know about elsewhere, is if you're watching a baseball game with one of these sporting apps, you can literally bet on whether the next pitch will be a ball or a strike. So, every 15 seconds, you have an opportunity for a dopamine hit. And I guarantee you, these things are being designed by hundreds of PhD psychologists who come from the rat torturing division of psychology. And they know how our intermittent reinforcement of dopamine works. And they design these things to be maximally addictive. Now, anyone standing back a ways and applying omni-consideration would say that this is the best use of a bunch of smart and capable people addicting young men with a taste for beer to having their wallets drained by sports gambling apps. I sure the hell don't know how we'd get that if we had an omni-considerate decision-making process, but I sure as shit see how we could get it if the pruning rule is, will this be profitable when exploited to the maximum degree, right? And so that's what we got. And so choose your pruning rules carefully. The set of pruning rules that Game A has, while good in some ways, is very, very bad in others. I would say the money on money return pruning rule, for instance, encouraged the opioid addiction crisis, where everybody turned a blind eye to what was going on, and millions of Americans, particularly working class Americans, became addicted to opioids. The forever chemicals. A little bit of foresight, we should have said a really bad idea to insert chemicals that are somewhat toxic and carcinogenic into our society that will never break down. Yes, there's some mild advantage to having frying pans that are easier to clean, but at the cost of introducing forever chemicals into our ecosystem, it seems insane. But it was a profitable decision for the makers of frying pans. Oh, my frying pan will outsell yours because it's got a non-stick surface. And so the money on money return pruning rule called that into being. And if we think about what comes next from a society being omni-considerate about what our pruning rules ought to be for the constant jumps to the adjacent possible. These jumps are happening many, many times a day. And they're basically mediated by, can I get someone to adopt it? Can I get money to finance it? Is it likely to be profitable? And while that brings some good things into being, it also brings some bad things into being. And I would argue a society that is thoughtful about how it designed itself would not have those two as its premier.
So with all of that booted into our consciousness now, what do you think might happen if we did the following? Just like intellectual property should become public domain at one point, a company, let's say Google as an example, after 25 or 50 years, cannot be sold anymore to private equity or anything. It can only be sold to the public. It can become a public institution, public piece of infrastructure. But the selling price depends on your net contribution to the planet. So it could be that at that point, you have to pay, the company's taken away from you and you have to pay because your net was negative. Or if your net was positive, you get some money back. What do you think might happen?
I think it's a brilliant idea. I would also say it would be a natural point for the blight. because the payoff would be so big in either direction that there would be gigantic incentives to corrupt whoever it is that's setting the price.
Okay.
If you had a trustworthy mechanism for setting the value, I think it'd be quite brilliant. And the interesting thing about it is it would inform decisions from a quite early stage, right?
Yeah.
I'm starting a company, and well, a good part of my terminal value is in selling this thing to become a public benefit corporation. And society as a whole will buy it from the shareholders. But the more value add we are to humanity, the better our price will be. In fact, I would be opposed to that rule being a pretty general one. And maybe it's not 50 years, maybe it's 10 years, right? So that the people have the incentive structure to be of benefit to society rather than to feel, not only find out how to exploit people, but to show the next rounds of investors that this is a generalizable game of exploitation. Why are Facebook and Google and TikTok worth so much? Because not only are they exploiting in real time, but investors say, oh, these are platforms in which we can exploit harder and harder and more and more. And so therefore it's worth paying big premiums on their current exploitations because their future exploitations will be even more. And a system like this would change the incentives very significantly, because not only would you be subtracting from your terminal value substantially by building a business model and exploitation, but you would get a negative hit on your terminal value by optimizing your infinitely expandable platform for exploitation. I love it. But with the problem, watch out for the corruption of the valuation.
That's a difficult one. It needs to be. It ties back to the transparency rule, right? With full transparency and a non-corruptible data source for that valuation, that's the, I think, only way to organize that. And this is very difficult in complex. I mean, anybody to do with impact measurement in impact investing has to deal with that all the time. That impact measurement is highly complex. But I could see some form of an institutionalized version of that through the existing tax authorities, right? On a yearly basis, defining the measurement rules at which your value towards the commons is determined, and you review that, and you have transparency layers in there. That could be an extension of an existing institution towards this.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Another one I'm just thinking here as we were talking about this, thinking in real time. Suppose the purchases was set by a distributed purchasing method. So we talked earlier about these shared purses of, that are the collected assets of many, many entities that are greater than one person. And to finish, actually, I'm going to finish this collection of purses of assets. So the Dunbar number community builds up its assets, but it may also choose to push some of them up to a higher level. So membranes of membranes, and maybe you take 10% of the excess you generated each year and you push it up to your bioregional membrane. And it has now assets that it manages for the common good of its members. And oh, by the way, if the common members of the membrane don't like what the membrane's doing, they leave. They use voice and exit to exit, and then they also get the rights to take back some proportion of the shared assets at the next level. Maybe somewhere in the stack of assets is where the public gets to decide how much it's willing to pay for Google. Of course, you want the alternative to be death, right? So Google just disappears, and that should be an option, by the way. That's the zero value or net negative value. But if there's enough people in the world who diversely value Google enough to buy it and turn it into a public benefit corporation, then we all raise our hands and say, oh, our little intermediate level membrane, we got dollars in the bank, we'll bid, or we'll provide 50 million into the pool because we believe that having Google is worth us contributing 50 million to have it. But if nobody raises their hands and nobody is willing to contribute to the fund to buy out Google, it dies hard. Boom. Right. Think about that as an algorithm. Again, I just made that up, so it might suck, but I kind of like it.
Yeah, I like it because of its distributed nature, it might be able to bind the blight problem that you
makes it harder. I mean, if you have to corrupt 1,000 membranes, that's a hell of a lot harder than corrupting one tax official. Right?
We should have that conversation as a thought experiment with Sergey and Larry to see if they would start allocating money towards those 1,000 membranes in time to corrupt them. Yeah, but which is I can totally see happening.
Yeah, it is interesting. Probably guys like Sergey and Larry.
They wouldn't, maybe. Yeah.
Sergey Brin and Larry Page. If we had caught them when they were 25, they might have loved this idea. But and maybe they still love it. I don't know. But being a billionaire seems to be a seductive thing, right? Mm-hmm. And not that many billionaires seem to be able to step back from voracious consumption and aggregation. They all want more. Actually, I might have that conversation with them. I could probably get to Larry Page and at some point and sit down and chat with him about this and say, all right, Larry, I think your 25-year-old Larry would have loved this. What's the 47-year-old Larry think about this, right? Would you be willing to do this, right? It would be interesting. Zuckerberg, too, My guess is that Zuckerberg was an okay dude, bit of a pervert, but an okay dude when he was 25. But he's been sucked into, being part of mammon, essentially, where all he wants to do is grow his net worth,
that's actually a fun idea. Once we publish this, we can send it to some of the early people at Google and see if it reaches Sergey and Larry. Maybe they want to reach it.
I can probably get it to Larry. Whether he'll look at it or not, I don't know. But I can probably get it on his desk. So that would be an interesting thing to do. We probably want to turn it down into an essay or something that you could read in 5 minutes and say, these people are nuts. And then invite, say, hey, would you like to chat with us about this? Because if you're serious, we're serious, right?
Yeah, that's fun. Do that. Okay. That was another amazing excursion. I think we're almost at 1.5 hours now. I think we can close it for today and maybe find some more time in the next days, depending on your schedule. I don't know how that looks.
This was a very good conversation. It was, kind of went off into some new things and explored some older ideas in a richer way. I thought it was a good conversation.
I like that.